Welcome. Welcome to today's German Marshall Fund panel on global leadership for an internet that supports democratic values. I'm Karen Kornbluh, director of GMF Digital and former ambassador to the OECD. A large number of people have registered for this event, and we'll try to get to as many audience questions as possible during the question and answer period. Please submit your questions using the question function at the bottom of your screen. We're convening this event today to discuss an issue that hasn't been mentioned at all in the presidential election, but we feel is tremendously important: the contest over the future of the internet and digital trade. Fortunately, we've assembled a panel of the people best able to tell us where we should go next. It is my great honor to introduce this distinguished group of diplomats. Anthony Gardner is the former US ambassador to the EU, now at the Brunswick Group and with a long relationship with the German Marshall Fund. Catherine Novelli was the Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment, and is now a professor at Georgetown University and president of Listening for America. Danny Sepulveda is former ambassador, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and U.S. Coordinator for Communications and Information Policy, which I think he somehow managed to do all at once, and he is now at Media Math. David Gross is also a former ambassador, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and U.S. Coordinator for Communications and Information Policy, and he is now the co-chair of the Telecom Media and Technology Practice at Wiley Ryan. We're so delighted and honored that you all are joining us today. I want to start by just setting the table. So I'll ask an opening question, but you should all answer it from your various areas of expertise. The U.S. led the world in creating the policy framework that resulted in the global open internet and trade in digital goods and services. And now, when it's time to update that framework to address new challenges, and they're serious new challenges, we're confronting China and other authoritarian countries with very different visions that would undermine human rights, rule of law, and so much about the trading system that we care about. So we care about because of it leading to prosperity. We don't care about it in and of itself. So Kathy Novelli, maybe we could start with you and just have you set the table from where you sat then and where you sit now, how you see these issues.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Karen. And I just have to say it's an honor to be here with all of the other panelists who are each excellent in their own right. So just to start, I think there's sort of four, I would say, buckets of things that are really important to look at. And the first one is pretty obvious, and that's access to the internet. Because all of these issues don't really matter if you don't have access. And that comes in a couple forms. That is, all of the millions and millions of folks who don't have any access, including some people in the United States. And so we need to think about how we're going to continue to promote that, partly because in terms of democracy, having access to the flow of information is key to democracy. The other piece of that is there are, as you were alluding to, Karen, attempts to kind of break up the internet, if you will, create walled gardens of the internet. And I think we really have to push back on that. It defeats the whole purpose of the internet, and in terms of the free flow of information, really puts a spanner in those works. And I think we absolutely need to work with our allies to try to move that forward. At the same time, we have to have our own house in order, and we need to look at how we are going to build out access to broadband on a more equitable basis internally in the US as well, because we have to lead by example. The second bucket is competition. You cannot have innovation without competition. Just doesn't happen in a vacuum. And obviously, there's a lot of attempts right now to think about how to deal with that. China's looking at that and has been. The EU is looking at that and has been. And now the US is looking at that. And we have a real vested interest in making sure that we find a way to deal with and maintain competition so that we can continue to innovate and other actors can come in and innovate, but at the same time not use a meat cleaver to do it. And so I think in order for us to lead, we have to figure out how we are going to deal internally, but then robustly engage both of the Chinese and the Europeans to figure out how and what form of regulation or promoting competition is going to take in a way that doesn't result in a heavy-handed approach. Third is cybersecurity. Huge issue, which I think we really have not gotten our arms around, not certainly not internationally. And I think we really need to think about how we're going to address that, and not just from the approach of principles, which are super important, but also how in a practical way do we get the best and the brightest together to start thinking about what we can do and what is a good forum for that. And, you know, the OECD might be a very good forum for that. But it needs to go beyond policy. And we need to at least start working with like-minded countries on that. And last, I think it is very, very important that we continue to fund science and technology, basic science and technology research, not just for the benefits of the exact research that's funded, but all of the add-on benefits. If you think about all the businesses that were created as a result of GPS, for example. And so, you know, we need to lead there so that our companies and future companies will be able to reap the benefits. So I think leadership is about engaging internationally, but it's also about engaging domestically.
That's terrific. Thank you so much. Tony, I'd like to bring you in. Kathy mentioned alliances, and our alliances have been weakened, let's use that word, over the last few years. And a key alliance, obviously, is with Europe. We have a bunch of issues that we disagree with Europe on right now: tax, privacy, and so on. How do we strengthen that alliance in this context so that we can work with them on the values that we want to see promoted?
Well, great. Well, thanks for that question. It's also wonderful to be here with so many former colleagues and current friends, I should say. You know, I want to give a positive spin to this, so and focus on Europe naturally. But look, yes, we've disagreed with Europe on a number of things. You've mentioned digital taxation, but I'm relatively confident that should Biden win, we could re-engage with the OECD to get an agreement, because we are close to an agreement on the so-called Pillar 2, which is the global minimum taxation. I think we could get to an agreement on Pillar 1, which is the rules governing taxation that countries would impose on profits by the companies make selling to consumers in those jurisdictions. So I don't think a deal is outside our grasp. And I think it is reasonable to depart from the assumption that the current rules of international taxation are not fit for purpose, particularly in the digital age when a lot of profits are made through consumers interacting with platforms where they generate value. And I don't think that value is now properly taxed. On Privacy Shield, another area where many of us on this call were involved, we knew at the time the risks that it would be invalidated. It has been invalidated. Yes, that's going to be difficult to fix for reasons I think everyone is aware of, particularly about judicial redress for non-US citizens in US courts. We can tweak with the agreement probably on various aspects, the ombudsman and other areas as well, but this is going to be a difficult area. But what I wanted to say is that there are a number of areas where we really should be engaging now. Now, particularly because the EU is in the middle of amending its e-commerce directive and proposing a Digital Services Act by the end of the year. And now because I'm beginning to see alignment. The winds are changing also in Washington, DC. We're seeing alignment on some core principles, even if we don't agree, on some core principles, which were flagged, by the way, in a terrific report I just read. I just wanted to give a shout out to a report that was drafted by a working group that was chaired by Susan Ness and by Maricia Skaka, formerly of the European Parliament. And they talk about a number of principles such as transparency, reducing the amount of asymmetry that currently exists, massive asymmetry, between the knowledge that these online platforms currently have about what they do and what the rest of the world knows about what they're doing, right? The regulators and the public. And that needs to be reduced by opening up some of their decision-making to outside scrutiny. The second is accountability, having true accountability by third parties in terms of forcing those online platforms to be clear about their promises and the transparency obligations, and having independent oversight about whether or not they're living up to those obligations. Now, neither of those should be too difficult actually to enforce. And I see us being able to work together on curbing hate speech and terrorist content, right? I mean, we just saw in Paris a terrible event, which given another impulse to see, can we deal with this, for example, by slowing the virality, the speed at which this content travels across the internet? I think we can. Electoral integrity as well is another hugely important issue where I see the US and the EU working together. Artificial intelligence, what is ethical and what isn't ethical AI? The EU once again has been a leader on this issue. The last 4 years, I don't think the United States has done enough to really tackle the concepts of what is and what is not ethical AI. And finally, I think we're beginning on both sides of the Atlantic to believe that there is a need for regulation, that we can't outsource these very difficult issues to private citizens who are running companies that essentially are acting like de facto states and having control over millions, if not billions of citizens. And judge-made law through court system isn't going to be enough. We need regulation. And the second thing, and here I'll end, Karen, is I think on both sides of the Atlantic, we're coming to a conclusion that antitrust law isn't enough, that it isn't broad enough. We should be looking at the lens or the question that this panel has before, and that is the future of democracy and the quality of debate and the future of our election system. And should we not have tools at our disposal that go much broader than whether or not consumers are harmed by actual or potential price rises? So the short answer I would give is that this is a great time for us to be working with our allies, particularly the EU, because it's a good at regulation and they've been at the forefront. So I'm positive.
Well, I don't think you know this, but you were just giving an advertisement for the program at GMF. Susan Ness is a fellow with us, and we've been doing a lot of work on exactly the issues that you're talking about in term and really working on some transatlantic dialogue with people who are at the forefront of that. So we couldn't agree more. Danny, I want to bring you in. We talked about the alliance with Europe. But part of what you did when you were in government was really try to expand the table and deepen our alliances in these contests that you were especially focused on about the future of the internet, where we saw China, Russia, Iran, and others trying to change the terms of the debate. And I, talk about whatever you want from that experience and where you see things going, but I especially want to draw on that experience that you had.
Thank you very much, Karen. And it's really great to be here with all of you, and especially to hear my former boss, Kathy, articulate how very well the 4 buckets of challenges, and hearing from Tony as well. And I want to echo what you said about the work that the GMF is doing. A lot of the issues that Tony raised around, for example, the virality of how misinformation and disinformation spreads on the internet are issues that the GMF is working on very hard, and issues on transatlantic cooperation around ideas of how to best govern the internet within the cooperation and concentration of Western values. So yes, I focused at my time at the State Department in particular on developing country democracies in Southeast Asia, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Singapore, trying to make sure that we had those alliances around common values of democratic discourse, democratic openness and commerce, and engaging those as well in India and Brazil and Latin America and Mexico. And the reason for that is that I think, and as we see China move to make major investments around the world in infrastructure, including telecommunications and technological infrastructure, they're not doing that for free. They are pulling levers in governments around the world to ensure, one, that they own the pipes through either Huawei or ZTE going to people's homes, and that they have the capacity to control content over those pipes. That is fundamentally a violation of the underlying things that excited us about, as both progressives and Americans, about the potential of the internet as a force for democratic discourse and the opening of commercial markets for anyone to engage. And so to keep that promise true, we do have to return to first principles and think about the vulnerabilities of the internet to concentration of markets and to a lack of oversight over how private actors manage the way people interact across their properties. So again, I think that those challenges remain. I'm a huge believer in engagement. I'm a huge believer in international institutions. And I believe that we should engage not just in the areas where we agree, but in the areas where we disagree, and do so forcefully but respectfully, and try to win the war of ideas, because there are people listening and trying to figure out where in the world they should fit in what is starting to look like a digital Cold War, with a whole non-aligned group of countries looking for guidance and leadership, and we have to fill that void. And we won't be able to do it alone. We have to do it with our friends in Europe. We have to do it with democratic developing nations.
Thank you. And David, I want to bring you in and drawing on your leadership on these issues when the US was working so hard with multi-stakeholder and multilateral institutions around managing challenges of the internet, while also trying to protect, human rights and so on. Can you tell us about some of that early work and what's at risk? I know you've been focused on some near-term immediate risks. And everybody has talked about some of them, but I know there's some specific ones at the UN that we have to keep our eye on.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. And it's a great privilege and honor to be on this great panel. And thank you, Karen, for organizing it. Thank you to the German Marshall Fund for hosting us. It's really terrific. I couldn't agree more with all the comments that have already been made. And I think that really speaks very strongly to sort of the core American interests here. I think we think about these things in a very consistent fashion, which is extraordinarily important, because as we all understand, the technology is constantly changing and the impact of technology is constantly changing. I think as both looking backwards and looking forwards, one of the things which I think I certainly have learned, and I think we've all learned, is that global leadership really begins at home. And by that, I mean what it is that we do, what we say, how we act, what our values are expressed, not just in words, but in deeds, here in the United States, really resonates globally. If we say something internationally that is not based upon what we do domestically, it is dismissed. If in fact, however, we do things the way we say they should be done globally, and we live our own values, we are benefited, and people watch and try to replicate that because they see that it works. It works economically, it works politically, it works socially and culturally. And those things I think are extraordinarily important. So in the past, when we've had to engage, and we've had to engage on these issues for the past couple of decades now, very strongly internationally, whether it's at the UN, ITU in Geneva, OECD, Karen, as you know so very, very well, whether it's in Asia through APEC and ASEAN and so forth. What we have found is that both our partners and potential partners and our adversaries or potential adversaries watch us carefully, and watch what we do and watch what we say. So for me, at least, what I've always found to be key and core is that we need to focus on our core principles. What are they? They are competition, they are rule of law, they are free flow of information, and they are often, particularly in the internet space, based upon the First Amendment. Now we are unique. We all recognize how the United States is unique with the First Amendment. It does not translate often for other countries and other societies. We recognize that, but it is part of our DNA. And I think we often need to make sure that we stay true to our DNA. And the other part of our DNA that I think we have to always be very true to is the area of human rights. And it really covers most of the things that we've already just talked about and the other speakers have talked about. Human rights, as we see them, which are individual rights, not state rights, become core here. And that becomes very important for us as we work through these issues. Technology is always changing. The impact of technology is always changing. But our core interests in human rights, First Amendment, and related types of policies, as I say, part of our American DNA, serves us very, very well in the international community.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you all for drawing on your experiences to help us see the big picture and all the stakes here. I wanted to come back to Tony because there was something that you said before we turned on the public video, which was you were talking about standards. And I think we often think of standard setting as a marginal issue and it's just for companies to worry about. How do we need to look at standards and how do they fit into this picture that's been painted?
Well, yeah, Karen, you're right. It's often considered to be extremely technocratic, down in the weeds. I actually think this is a top 5 issue for the US and the EU. It's that important, along with, well, climate change and other issues, but it's a top 5 issue. And by the way, the Chinese have identified this as a super important issue. They've identified in their 2035 plan, not just to dominate certain industries of the future, but to dominate world standard setting organizations. And they're already doing it pretty effectively. To my knowledge, they now have placed their people, their guys, at the head of the International Telecommunications Union, the International Electrotechnical Commission, the International Standards Organization, and the National Civil Aviation Organization, if I'm right. I think there may be a few others. And those organizations, as I think we all know, are important because they set standards for big chunks of the world. And not only do they enshrine an advantage for exporters of countries whose standards these organizations set, in this case the Chinese, but they also set values for the world. Now, I discovered, we were talking about before this program, that there is a bill before the House. It's called Ensuring American Leadership Over International Standards Act of 2019. And so this is very much before our legislators is a key issue. And the US and the EU really should be, through some body, whether it's a new technology council or otherwise, focusing on how we can together be more forceful in defending our values and our standards, and also placing our people at the head of those organizations. Now, the last thing I'll say, give an example of how important this is. These organizations set standards for emerging areas like facial recognition, for video monitoring, for 5G, for city and vehicle surveillance. All of these things are incredibly important. So that's why I think this is the top 5 issue.
That's great. And another issue I just wanted to bring in, Kathy, you're focused on attitudes towards globalization and trade, and these are closely linked. We sometimes talk about the internet separate from trade in goods and services, but obviously, as we're seeing, Danny brought up the Huawei situation. The State Department has this clean network plan. How do you feel Americans who we understand are very nervous about their jobs, very nervous about how vulnerable they are? How do you see them thinking about these issues? And is there support still for this global internet and global trade in digital goods and services? How do the American people feel about it? Where do we
Well,
go?
I can't speak for all the American people, but I, as we talked about before we started, we have been doing through Listening for America focus groups and informal listening sessions in every region of the country for the last 2.5 years. And I was very surprised talking to people about trade and globalization. I expected a lot more negativity than I found. I think people understand that there's a benefit to globalization, that they benefit from it. And when you ask people about that, they have some concerns about, manufacturing jobs depending on where they live. But they also recognize that, they are able to get things a lot cheaper and at better quality. One thing that isn't really understood very well is trade and services, which is, of course, what is connected to the internet, and how the US provides services, that we have a trade surplus in services, et cetera. And so I would say it's not that there's a lack of support. I just think there's a lack of understanding. And that is something that I think is important that we start doing a little more education so that we can continue with our policies to push forward with public support. And as I said, I don't think there's a lack of public support. There's just kind of a lack of understanding of what is going on.
Danny, I want to go back to you because you brought up Huawei and some of the issues around that. And, there's been a lot of discussion about the clean network proposal and what's gone on with TikTok. And there's the administration has talked about national security concerns, but there's been a real fear. I mean, you talked about this Cold War and the war of ideas, especially with those who are so far unaligned. And I think part of the criticism is that the national security argument hasn't been made clearly enough. And then others are just anyway, that's one of the arguments that's been made. And so I guess my question is, do you feel like this is the right approach that the administration has been taking? And if you don't, is it the substance or the style that needs to be refined?
Well, I would argue that it's both substance and style, and that they've done it poorly altogether. I want to follow up on what Tony said around standards. What China's trying to do through standard setting in global organizations is create an unlevel playing field that benefits their providers, Huawei, ZTE. We in Europe have a shared interest in making sure that does not happen, right? And then the other thing that I would say around the issues of national security and telecommunications and technology is, I can tell you, we all had access to our intelligence communities. We all worked closely with our security agencies. And, I have never met a more capable, honorable group of public servants in my entire life. And what I think the Biden administration needs to do is sit down around a table and get into information that we don't have access to see what the exact threats are, and then to the degree that we're going to counter them, not do so unilaterally. We need to work with our allies, whether that be Australia, our traditional allies in the Five Eyes, or our friends in India who have no interest in seeing China take over that part of the world, or our friends in Latin America who have no interest in becoming vassal states to China. We will not win this alone. We do not need to win this alone. And those security threats that are security threats to us are security threats to the democratic world in general.
Anyone want to add to that? Any thoughts on that?
No, I would just underscore both what Danny and Tony have said. The issue of standards has clearly moved from the technical area of that only a few people either understand or care about to something that is very core. And there are a variety of reasons for that, but it is going to be extraordinarily interesting to watch how that develops. One of our core views, of course, has been that, and Kathy really touched on this earlier, is the universality of the internet and its interoperability piece, and how we manage to continue to try to maintain that while at the same time ensuring that we are not driven by adverse economic and political interests here will be a real challenge. I've been interested in some of the recent discussions about the creation of what sometimes people call a D10 or D12, a group of core democratic countries to have common views that have some common values and some common views in this area. I would not be surprised to see that starts to translate into standards organizations that are made up of companies and organizations and governments from them to try to bake in some of the issues that we're discussing, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's intellectual property related issues and the like. But it's going to be a real interesting challenge over the next couple of years.
And can I just add to that as well? I think, in the past, the US government has somewhat taken a hands-off approach to standards in this area because, it's the private companies and their engineers who've been working on them. And I think we cannot afford to continue to do that, as Danny said. On the one hand, the idealized view is that, the best technology will win out and the engineers will figure it out. But what has happened is that particularly China has gotten extremely assertive, and those actors are not just purely private sector. And so I think we cannot just sit back and let that happen, and fully agree that we will not prevail if we just try to do things unilaterally.
That's great. So I'm going to follow up on that with a question from someone we both know, Kathy, Lisa Arian, who asks a question that dovetails really well. She says, many of the organizations relevant to governing these topics, like the ITU and the WTO, are slow moving and difficult to influence. Do you think it makes sense, or there is any potential to make progress with our allies in a way that's more nimble? And, David has put this D10 idea on the table, but there are obviously other options in other institutions. And everyone else, if you would submit questions at the bottom of your screen under Q&A, our panel has generously offered to answer your questions.
Well, I would just say, and everyone should chime in, but I think we have to look at ways that are more nimble, because technology just keeps moving. And if we don't look at how we can gather like-mindeds and act more nimbly, those who are now using these institutions to their own advantage for their own political and economic advantage are going to continue to do that. So I think David's, talking about a D10 or some sort of group of like-mindeds who also have market power, I think is going to be very, very important.
Tony, what do you think about the G7, the G20? What is their role here?
Well, I was going to agree with what Kathy said. Is that, look, surprise, surprise, I was going to say U.S. and the EU together, given the number of consumers that they have, the power of their markets, and the power of our standard setting for the whole world. The EU for the last 4 years has been the de facto regulator of Silicon Valley, and has been ahead of us in thinking about a lot of these issues we've been talking about, including artificial intelligence and facial recognition. If we were to work with the EU on common set of standards, there's a fair chance that we could actually push that out to a much broader set of countries. So I think that's right. It's a very strong argument that, I wouldn't say we should put all our eggs in the basket of working with these organizations, but we need to do that while focusing on our closest partners, EU, Japan, Australia, Canada, and so on. But we should do that right away. The clock is ticking.
Anyone else want to take this?
Now, I would just also maybe just mention, I was a little surprised it didn't get more attention, maybe because it's very, very, there's not a lot of meat on the bones, but the administration issued last week a national strategy for critical and emerging technologies that actually touches on both of these things. I'll just read you the two of the pillar one points. They say, lead the development of worldwide technology norms, standards, and governance models that reflect democratic values and interests. And then they go on to say, build strong and lasting technology partnerships with like-minded allies and partners, and promote democratic values and principles. I would note that the fact that this administration, of all administrations, is talking about working with allies in this area, I think underscores how critically important that is. This is not an administration that's known for its multilateral love of multilateralism, and yet they are calling for that in this very space.
I want to bring in, an issue that I think is on a lot of people's minds, especially maybe in Europe. This is from Jean-Francois Boitin, and he says, I'll just use his words, isn't the major issue the fact that the internet, yesterday seen as a force for good, has also become a force for evil? And I think that's a question that we have to grapple with. What are we going to do to update the policies around the internet, and not just take not just ignore some of the problems that people have around the world? And, Danny, anyone want to take this one? Answer it however you like.
Yeah, I mean, Karen, you and I go way back, and I think when we
Don't tell people how far back, Danny.
When we were working back then for Senator Barack Obama, we were all enamored with the potential of the internet as a platform and force for good, and by that we meant a force for democratization and the spread of opportunity, and the ability for people to express themselves freely without intervention by the state or intervention by an incumbent power. So yes, and I think I still believe in all of those things. But what we've learned is that technology can be used for bad purposes as well as good purposes. And to some degree, I think when we're talking about the internet, we have to be careful to differentiate between the internet as an underlying commons and then the individual platforms that are private and operated on top of the internet. And the degree to which those remain commercial actors that require democratic oversight, that is where we've been slow to come to terms and consensus on what to best do to ensure that these tools and these platforms, which are unprecedented in history in terms of their power, are properly managed to ensure that they aren't improperly used or abused. And I think it's critically important that we come to some form of consensus with our colleagues across the Atlantic and in democratic developing countries on the best approach forward for that.
One of the things that I've wanted just to stick with you, Danny, for a second is these multi-stakeholder institutions that were set up to govern the internet often don't deal with a lot of the issues that are seen as national policy issues. And yet a lot of these countries don't have the capacity they just don't, they don't have maybe the manpower to deal with this, and they're just sort of left on their own. Do you think there's more work that the international community could do, almost the way people do, model laws for the states, to help folks think about what are some regulations that allow for human rights and democratic discourse, but also maybe deal with some of the challenges that national governments face?
Right, I think that's the right question, and I think that there's an immense amount of good that has come out of the multi-stakeholder process and the multi-stakeholder institutions that establish a groundwork or a first draft of how to move forward on those issues on a national level. So I wouldn't disinvest in those. In fact, I'd invest more in them. But at the same time, I'd make them more inclusive, and I would recognize the right and responsibility of states and policymakers to make law and to engage in commercial oversight. And we accentuated the multi-stakeholder process and didn't invest enough in developing the capacity of bureaucracies around the world to understand these issues and to engage in them in under their value structure for the exercise of governance of commerce in their nations. Right?
Yeah, and when I was at the OECD, just to give an advertisement for this, we did adopt, Danny Weitzner was really critical in this, these OECD internet policymaking principles that tried to create a framework for that there would be these international principles, but that national governments would make their own laws. But I think there's a lot of work to be done following up on that kind of approach. So it's interesting. Yeah, sorry, who wanted to talk? Was that Tony?
I was just going to jump in here for just a second. I think Danny made a very important point. We can't be outsourcing the policing of our democracy to private parties. And I don't think it's even fair. Some CEOs of major platforms have said as much, that they shouldn't be the ultimate arbiters that are being pulled in one direction or another. This election has made that very clear. It's a very uncomfortable position for them to be in. So the questions posed by The member who was watching, I think, is absolutely right that some of these platforms, of course, have been abused to propagate terrorism, hate speech in a way that we didn't anticipate. But it's not only that. My point is, it's not only that. I think the problem is broader. The recent program, The Social Dilemma, perhaps was extreme, but it posed an interesting issue. Is there something inherent about the business model of some of these companies that seeks to monetize all of us as users with their platforms, but as a result of that needs to push out messages that incite or divide us in a way to boost their earnings? I think that's a legitimate question to ask, and we need to, as democratic societies, really face up to that. And as I was saying earlier, it's not just a question of antitrust law. I think our democracies are at stake, so our tools should be much broader.
And if I could just add, I think that one of the things that's really important is how do you balance our core adherence to the First Amendment with the question of what are facts, what are not facts, what are things that incite terrorism, et cetera. And the question of censorship of speech, I think, becomes very, very difficult because, you know, when you think about what was going on in the past, there wasn't this immediate and widespread spreading of information. And, you know, I'm not suggesting we rethink the First Amendment, but I think that trying to find that line is extremely important to try to think about. And I'm not sure that there's a clear answer.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and think the differences between the US and Europe are probably less than people think, because none of us wants to, hopefully, compromise free expression. And so figuring out a way to deal with some of these issues without compromising free expression should be a common, I hope, a common goal. I just want to turn to one really tangible, you know, less abstract issue, which is Privacy Shield, because I know everybody's cut their teeth on that and bled for it. And so Peter Chase of GMF asks, his basic question is, you know, is there really a way to bridge these differences when the US has these practices that the European Court of Justice has criticized? You know, are we ever going to change those practices? You know, would our intelligence community ever, you know, and our Congress and our administration ever go along with that? And if not, you know, can we come to agreement with Europe over any new program? Or is there a different way forward? I have no idea what the answer to that one is. So,
If I could take
anybody?
Or Dan, go ahead.
Sorry. Thank you, Tony. You know, I think it's a blessing that when we were at the State Department, we had Kathy at a position of the undersecretary who had an interest in the security, the commercial, and the human rights aspects of global internet governance. And I think we should formalize that structure within the State Department to ensure that it gets the proper attention necessary and that we're negotiating at the proper level necessary with our colleagues around the world, but particularly in Europe. And the issues around security and how our nation approaches security issues on the internet will have to be a core component of conversation, discussion, and deliberation, as it was when we constructed the Privacy Shield. And our intelligence community made an immense amount of movement in order to bring some degree of comfort to our colleagues in the EU. We're going to have a conversation about making an assessment of where we stand, where the ECJ thought we fell short, and what we can think about creatively to ensure that we can come into a compliant mechanism for the transfer of data across the transatlantic, because not having that is not an option. It's not a commercial option. It's not a democratic option. It's not a diplomatic option. It would be insane to break the transatlantic digital relationship. It would cede the world to China. And so I think that at that level, we just need to really elevate and involve a stronger and higher level of the administration in the resolution of this issue, because it must be resolved?
It's a tough question Peter asked. I'm slightly skeptical. We went as far as we could. It was already pretty painful, if I could use that word, because the mere concept that our intelligence services should be seen to be, quote unquote, negotiating with the European Union or with a foreign state about their practices was kind of a very difficult concept. Not saying that nothing can be done. I suggested a few areas where we can make it more robust. And, we should push the envelope here. By the way, the Judicial Redress Act was considered to be hopeless when we first thought about it, and we pushed it out to Congress, and it passed by a very large majority on a bipartisan basis. Now, that was frankly small potatoes compared to the concept that we should really grant non-US citizens constitutional rights and amend, fundamental laws that govern intelligence. But I wouldn't exclude it. Brad Smith suggested a concept which is pretty far reaching. I don't see it happening right away, but he suggested that the rights should travel with the bits. So the rights of European citizens when they travel through the pipes across the Atlantic into the United States should bear European rights. Do I see that happening in the short term? No, I don't, but it's something we should consider.
Anyone else? You guys all thought you were done with Privacy Shield.
Well, we knew that there was a chance that that we'd be back in this soup. We hoped we wouldn't, but I fully agree with Danny that not finding a path forward is not an option, to use double negatives. I mean, we have to find a way for data to move. And I don't know what that way is. One wonders if part of that, and this is probably anathema to say, but maybe the Europeans also have to look at what they are demanding of us, because the ECJ is basing its decision on the way that the law in Europe is written. So I think, the question is, how do we find a compromise in a way forward that allows us to, and our intelligence community to feel like they are protecting our national security, and are, and yet comply with the norms that are important to Europe. And no matter what we do, I think there are those inside Europe who are going to agitate to say that things are not valid. And I would suggest that part of that agitation is not necessarily in the interest of the US-EU relationship.
So I want to ask more about China, but about this idea that we are entering a Cold War with them. The current strategy of the administration seems to be that we are going to erect barriers. Our companies aren't going to be able to sell to many of their companies. And China is responding, or was already doing this, is cutting off access to US companies. Richard Danzig just had a recent report that said this strategy is not a good one, and that we should be much more incremental. We're so intertwined. The Cold War is just not the right model. And I wonder if you just, whatever thoughts you have on this, when we have this enormous country, this enormous market. We did come to agreement at the end of the Obama administration on the Paris Accords. There are things we need to work on together. How do we think about this issue of decoupling and competition with China? Did I stump you all?
Well, if I could say, I think that the idea that we are going to keep China down, and that's going to, and we're going to do it by, cutting off trade and access to technology, and somehow that alone is going to ensure our dominance. I think that is just I think it's a fool's errand. And I think we need to have a much more nuanced approach in our dealings with China. Um, and we need to make sure our own house is in order. So, when I was at Apple, one of the things that Steve Jobs used to say was, we need to run faster. And I think we absolutely need to make sure that we are doing that, so that our own house is in order and that we don't just rely on, oh, we're going to keep China down. At the same time, everything that we do with China is not adversarial. And I think we have to look at where is it that we can cooperate. And we have to continue to talk and dialogue and, of course, assert where we have disagreements, and be very firm about those. But I think just creating a Cold War is to everyone's detriment. There are a lot of problems that we need to work on together, like climate, where I think we have a partner who is willing to work with us.
No, Kathy's, look, it's absolutely right. Absolutely right. I mean, the view that we should keep China down, I think, is misguided, and it's not going to happen anyway. So it's totally counterproductive. And I don't think that would be the view of any incoming Biden administration. Rising China has had many positive effects, including domestically, but we know the negative effects as well, and we should talk about them. And 5G is an example where we may not like the strategy of Donald Trump, but he succeeded in Europe. I can tell you that. Sweden has been the latest country to follow suit. Italy in the last couple of days. The UK has changed, and it takes a real technical expert to understand the whole, the details behind this in terms of core and periphery and what represents a national security risk. But I think there were legitimate reasons to be highly skeptical that it was the right thing to allow a company that is under the influence, if not the control, of the Communist Party into very sensitive bits of our telecoms backbone. So I agree with Kathy. It's a mixture. It's not just it's not a confrontation all the time. It's competition. It's running fast, and it's pushing back when necessary.
I guess I would just add, I think I agree completely with what's been said. The way I see it is we need to be, this is always the case, but we need to be clear-eyed. And I think, at least in retrospect, perhaps we were not as clear-eyed about how China was developing and what its interests were and how it was expressing itself over the past few years, in part because we wanted to see something different. And we wanted to see a movement towards greater democracy. We wanted to see economic prosperity lead to closer relationships between our people and our economies and even our political systems in some degree. And with President Xi coming in, he has really, I think, brought to us more clearly that our interests has some very fundamental differences, whether they are political, whether they are military, whether they have to do with the way in which we'd like to see the world. But yet, we all realize, I think, that we are economically and otherwise interconnected. And we need to continue to figure out how to get the advantages of that interconnection without actually giving up, again, our core values and our core principles that have stood us very, very well for a long time. That's a challenge, but I think, if I may suggest, the way forward, in my experience at least, and I suspect in the experience of all of our panelists, is not by shutting things down, which is sort of implied by the sense of a Cold War, but rather from increased dialogue. Now, dialogue doesn't always result in action. It can result in action when it's in our collective best interest. But dialogue has a lot of very important advantages. And there are dialogues, particularly with people with whom you have some very fundamental disagreements. So if nothing else, we keep bad things from inadvertently happening, as has happened in the past. And we all want to make sure it doesn't happen going forward.
And can I just add to that? I think it is really important that in the areas where we do have critical disagreements, not only do we dialogue, but that we work with our allies who are more aligned with our own views, because just us trying to do this alone will not succeed. But I think we have a much better chance of succeeding and finding a path forward if we are working with our allies.
Danny, did you want to jump in?
I agree with all of that, particularly with Kathy's last point. I would say, however, that again, we don't know what we don't know because we're no longer in the administration and don't have access to the intelligence that underlies these decisions or actions. If we are going to decouple, it has to be significantly more thoughtful than the current strategy, and it has to be a strategy with a goal. We're missing all of that. I think it's almost strange that we went through the TikTok thing a couple of months ago, and TikTok is still a Chinese company and it's still operating in the United States. It's obvious that these things haven't been thought through or coordinated. And so we need to be significantly more careful. At the end of the day, much like climate change, we share a climate with China. We also at this point share a global network with them. And what I would ask for, and I think the American people are going to demand, is reciprocity and reciprocal respect and openness in terms of markets in particular, but also in the way that we're managing our more difficult and challenging aspects of our relationship.
It's a great reminder. We're 3 minutes away from the end, so I just want to give everybody a chance to say some final words. Maybe we'll go in the same order that we started in. And one of the things you might want to answer as you go through it is, we talked about alliances and so on, and we focused a lot on Europe, or we talked about a D10. How do we reach beyond that? So we don't want to create out groups, Ian Wallace is asking, who then become easy prey for the diplomacy of China. So if you don't have any final remarks, you can answer that one. But whatever your final thoughts are, and I guess the other thing I would focus you on, just to give you a lot of assignments, is what's first? What's the highest priority that you think for a new administration of either party?
Well, I hope that we, in terms of high priorities, I think we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. I think it is super important that we have our own house in order in terms of research, in terms of looking at competition, in terms of looking at access. I think that we, in terms of allies, I agree that we should not just be looking at Europe. I think we have to look beyond that. We've done a lot of development work in Africa and other parts of Asia and Latin America, and I think we need to be on all those fronts, not just only with Europe. Europe's super important. So to me, I think an all of the above kind of approach is what is absolutely needed. And we still have the opportunity to lead. And we have to continue to try to do that and not step away from the world in an isolationist manner.
So I agree with all of that, but for me, I think my first priority if I had the opportunity to serve again would be on getting our internal house in order. It is unconscionable that there are kids in America going to McDonald's to use the Wi-Fi to do their homework. Every home in America should have connection to the internet, and it's ridiculous that that's not the case. We can do that. We should have a national privacy law. It can be a construct that is not identical to Europe, might achieve the same ends differently, but we need to start leading in bringing forward not just in privacy, but in updating commercial law in all of these spaces. Gig workers, ensuring that they're getting the right benefits in the marketplace. Competition, ensuring that you don't have concentrated markets and that the internet doesn't become a place you go to through two pipes and no one else. Like these are all issues that we need to be leading on, because as we don't confront them, our colleagues abroad may be confronting them in a way that creates unintended consequences that we could help avoid. And our colleagues in China are just moving forward in a unilateral direction and trying to offer the developing world simple answers to complex questions.
I guess it's me, right? So look, I think Danny's absolutely right to talk about a federal privacy law. In fact, it's maybe a bit surprising it took us to the bottom of the hour to mention it. The time is now. Look, the stars could be aligned. And here again, I'm going to talk about US EU because it's what I know best. The stars could be aligned now for so many reasons. We've been absent for 4 years. The EU's been moving ahead and they're passing important legislation and the winds are blowing in Washington. So we could be aligned. And on the two core things I would say is ensuring that our election system is, we maintain the integrity of our election system and we address hate speech and terrorism online. We really should be working with the EU immediately. And by immediately, I say the next 18 months. Should Biden win 18 months before the next midterms, after people get their feet on the ground, that's the period of time we have. So we should be absolutely focused on those two core issues.
I would just add, first of all, of course, I agree with all the comments that were made before. At the risk of stating the obvious, there's an advantage for us, and by us, I mean not just the United States, but for Europe, like-minded countries in Asia, Africa, and South America, to the rise of China, and in the sense that China has shown its colors through statements by President Xi, by its actions in Hong Kong, by a whole host of things in which it's made itself clear. And that should bring those of us who believe in democracy and freedom and so forth closer together. It underscores the common bonds that we have, and we should build upon those common bonds as we've discussed for much of the past hour or so. The last thing I would mention is that at the risk of stating the obvious, one of the things we've learned over the past couple of decades, if not longer, is that technology is constantly evolving, and it's evolving in ways that are very unpredictable. And with the rise of 5G, just as was the case for 3G and 4G, it brings services, it brings opportunities, it brings economic potential benefits, it brings benefits for individuals in ways in which we cannot foresee. That's the great power of technology. It's one of the great powers, the benefits it can bring to people, while at the same time, of course, it will bring risks, whatever it is, privacy-related risks, security-related risks, and so forth. And so what seems to me we need to do is not build a world in which we exist in today, but to find the flexibility to change the rules of the road as our technology changes, as the impact of technology changes. And we should do that not just in the United States, but we need to do it deeply and clearly and completely with our allies in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere.
What a great closing, David. Thank you so much for wrapping that up. This was such a rich conversation. I felt like we touched on so many issues that, was issue spotting in a way. But I thought this was, you each obviously bring so much knowledge, experience, and foresight. And so thank you so much for sharing them today. Thank you very much.
Thanks.